Hello, I'm Miss Cassidy, and I am one of the government teachers. And in order to get through the content that we need to get through this semester, with only 90 minutes of class time, we've decided to break up the lectures and record them. I have the pleasure of doing Introduction to the Constitution notes. I do strongly encourage you to take notes. This is not a requirement, but for the test, you're going to be able to use notes on it most likely. So it would be helpful if you had your Constitution notes with you. So, to begin with, the Constitution was written in 1787 by the Founding Fathers in Philadelphia. They spent 3 months in the summer that year writing this document. And it starts first with the preamble, which is the introduction to the Constitution. It explains why they are writing this document, and it begins with the very famous phrase, "We the people." And "we the people" alludes to popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means that the power of government comes from the people. And while that doesn't sound that earth-shattering today, back in 1787, this definitely was. At that time, most governments were some type of monarchy, king, queen, emperor, and the power for the governments and for the leaders came from divine right through some kind of god. So the idea that the power of government comes from the people was pretty groundbreaking. It also talks about a more perfect union. The Constitution is actually our second government. Our first one was the Articles of Confederation, which you might remember from last year, was successful in getting us through the American Revolution in the first 8 or so years of our country, but it did have a lot of problems. And so instead of trying to fix that document, the Founding Fathers decided that, you know what, why don't we just get rid of it and we'll start fresh with the Constitution. And then finally, in the preamble, it lists the 6 purposes of government: to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, etc. The Constitution is not about our rights and freedoms. The Constitution is the foundation of our government. It explains what the government's responsibilities are, what each branch and authority figures get to do, and what they cannot do. So it's sort of like think of it like a building. It's the foundation of which our country is built upon in our government. From there, after the preamble, it goes into the articles. There are 7 articles. I like to think of them as chapters. So there's 7 articles or chapters into the Constitution that describe the government functions. The Constitution actually is in the back of your textbook, so you can reference it. It's about 12 pages long. And of those 12 pages, Article 1 or Chapter 1, the legislative branch makes up 6 pages of that. Of the 3 months I spent writing this document, the Founding Fathers spent better part of 2.5 months writing Article 1. The legislative branch is our Congress, the Senate, the House of Representatives, and they are charged with making our laws. Article 2 is the executive branch. They are responsible for enforcing the laws that the legislative branch makes. It's the president, the vice president, and the cabinet. And then finally, the third branch of government is the judicial branch. They are in charge of judging the laws. That's our Supreme Court and all of the other federal court systems. So as I mentioned, it's about 12 pages. Legislative branch is 6. The executive branch is about 2 pages. And unfortunately, the judicial branch gets a whole paragraph. It was almost sort of like an afterthought for the Founding Fathers. Not going to spend much time on the first 3 articles. Each of these articles and branches will be a separate unit for us over the course of the next semester. So moving on to Article 4. Article 4 is the powers of the states. One of the major problems with the Articles of Confederation, our first government, is that it gave almost too much power to the state governments and not enough to the federal government. However, in the Constitution, they couldn't just ignore the fact that the states had power because they were eventually going to need them to ratify it. So Article 4 is specifically what powers do the states have. It starts first with the full faith and credit clause. The full faith and credit clause states that documents that are legal in one state are legal in all states. So if a state issues you a document or a contract of some sort, then the other 49 states must respect the authority of that document. And many of you probably have one of these documents. If you have a driver's license at this point, that is a document that is issued by the state of California, and that is a legally binding document. So if you are going to drive out of state, probably not now, not in the age of COVID, but someday, if you are driving across country, and if you are unfortunately pulled over for speeding, the officer cannot give you a ticket for having a California driver's license in the state of Kansas. So you're allowed to drive on with your driver's license in any other state. If you do plan on going to college out of state, You do not have to get the driver's license of that state unless you plan on moving there permanently. So you can go to college and drive on your California license, and that is perfectly legal. Another document that is issued by the state that is legally binding in all the others is a marriage contract. So a marriage contract, I hate to take the love out of it, but really when you break it down, a marriage is a contract between two people. And if the state of California, if you get married here, they issue you your marriage certificate. And if you move to Texas, then you don't have to get remarried in the state of Texas. Texas will recognize your marriage. All right. Next, the next power of the states is Congress deciding on new states. So there's a few requirements for a territory to become a state. First and foremost, you have to have at least 60,000 people in population. The territory has to ratify the Constitution. But even after you do all that, if Congress says, you know what, we don't want this state to come in, then they can reject you. There is a place right now in our country that wants to become a state, and I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking Puerto Rico, but it is not Puerto Rico, at least not at this point. The territory now that wants to become a state actually is a district, and it is a district of Columbia, Washington, D.C. The Founding Fathers very purposely made the capital city a district. They didn't actually put it inside the borders of a state. So if you live in Washington, D.C., you live in the district. And they very much would like to become a state. But at this point, that has not been approved by Congress. The benefit of becoming a state for Washington, D.C. is they would have two voting members in the Senate, and they'd have a voting member in the House of Representatives. Right now, they just have a representative there that's able to attend committee meetings, but they have no vote. A few years ago, a wealthy individual from Silicon Valley decided that California was much too large and should be broken up into different states. His original proposal was that California would be broken up into 6 states. That didn't gain much traction, so he changed his plan. And now his plan is for California to be broken up into 3 different states. He got as far as having a petition. He had enough signatures. We were actually going to vote on it last year. The California Supreme Court put a stop to that. But if this does actually come to a vote, and if it passes, and if Congress accepts it, we would be living in Northern California at this point, as opposed to just regular California. So next, in terms of the final part of the powers of the states, is federalism. What is a division of power between a state government and the federal government? And I have a Venn diagram to show you. Each has their own powers or responsibilities. So, for example, the national government, Congress has the authority to declare war. The federal government has the ability to maintain our armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, etc. Only the federal government can coin money, and so on. On the state side, states get to establish and maintain schools. They get to decide on their marriage laws, who can be married, and etc. And then they have some shared powers. In other words, they both have the ability to do this. And probably the one if you have a job especially, you're probably most familiar with is the levying of taxes, meaning that the federal and state government, from your paycheck, they take a little bit of money from your paycheck. So that is federalism. Moving on to Article 5. Article 5 is adding amendments, and this is actually my favorite chapter or article, and I know what you're thinking, what a freak, she has a favorite article, but I do. And the reason I do is because when the Founding Fathers put the Constitution together, they understood that they weren't just making a document that was going to last 10, 15, or 20 years. They were hoping this document would outlive them by centuries. And so they understood that the document was going to have to be able to evolve as society evolved. So they created a way in which the document could be changed to meet the needs of those in the future. Now, the Articles of Confederation did have the ability to be amended. However, it was virtually impossible. You needed all the states to agree in order to change the Articles of Confederation, which meant that at that time you had to get all 13 states to agree. And of the 10 or so years the Articles of Confederation was in existence, it was changed a total of 0 times, so they never changed it. For the Constitution, they didn't make it so easy that we'd be changing it every 10 minutes, but they also did not make it impossible. So the first step in adding amendment is that 2/3 of the Congress or state governments have to agree to at least propose the amendment to look at it. And then in order for it to be ratified and added to the Constitution, you need 3/4 of the state governments have to approve it, and that is 38 states out of 50. In the last 240 or so years, the Constitution has been changed 27 times, the first 10 coming right away in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights and the actually all the amendments are in the back of your textbook as well. Here they are. The first 10, like I said, are called the Bill of Rights. They were added pretty quickly after the Constitution was ratified. They were added in 1791. And that is going to be a separate unit for us. So we'll look at those specifically. And then you have the other 17, with Amendment number 27 being the most recent one, added in 1992. There are some failed amendments that we'll look at, those that were proposed but were never ratified by the state governments. In 1876, there was an attempt to abolish the U.S. Senate. In 1893, they wanted to change the name of our country to the United States of the Earth. Also in 1893, they wanted to get rid of the Army and the Navy. And I know that sounds really crazy, but we were just entering into a pretty steep depression in the 1890s. And I guess they saw that as a way of saving some money by getting rid of the Army and the Navy. Next, in 1914, they decided, or they proposed at least, that divorces would be illegal. And then in 1916, there was a proposed amendment. And in 1916, World War I had been going on now for 2 years. The United States had not entered the war yet, but we were about a year away from entering into it. And so they wanted to change how our country would declare war. Currently, or right now, only Congress has the authority to declare war. So the proposed amendment would decide that all acts of war should be put to a national vote. Anyone voting yes has to register as a volunteer for service in the U.S. Army. So we'd eventually become a direct democracy temporarily. And if you wanted to support the war and go, you would also have to go fight it. Obviously, again, that one did not pass. In 1933, there was an attempt to limit your personal wealth to $1 million, which I know seems sort of crazy in a capitalist society. But remember, 1933, we were just coming off the worst year of the Great Depression. And so the idea that we would spread wealth around probably seemed like a pretty good one at the time. $1 million in 1933 is about $20 million in today's money. And then the last failed amendment we'll look at was proposed, in 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment, also known as the ERA. You may have heard of this one recently because it's been in the news this past year. It was originally written by Alice Paul in the 1920s, and it was proposed and accepted by Congress in 1972. And they did something really strange during the approval process. They added a time limit on how quickly this amendment had to be approved. They put a time limit of 7 years. So like I said, it got proposed by Congress in 1972, and then it went to the states for ratification. By 1975, you had 35 out of the 38 states that had ratified the amendment. So they were 3 short. In 1978, which was going to be the time limit, they still had not reached the number of 38. So Congress voted to give it another 7 years until 1982. At that point, you still did not have the 38 states. There were still only 35. Congress did not extend the deadline at this point, but it continues to come up over and over again. So you still had the original 35 that had ratified it. And then in 2017, Nevada approved the ERA amendment. In 2018, Illinois did, making it the 37th state. And then in January of 2020, this year, Virginia became the 38th state to ratify it. In February, the House of Representatives voted to nullify the deadline clause, which would have allowed the amendment to be added to the Constitution. But the Senate at this point has not voted on that resolution. There is a lot of discussion about whether or not that is actually legal, because that was a clause of it that it had to be ratified within 7 years. So if and when this ever gets passed, there's going to be some legal challenges to it. Okay, that's a whole lot on the Equal Rights Amendment. Let's get back to the Constitution. Next is Article 6. That is our Supremacy Clause. It states that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. There is Congress, the state governments, they cannot pass a law that would contradict the Constitution. And I'll give you a real simple example, which we'll cover again in the Bill of Rights. If hypothetically Congress passed a law that says you are required to stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance, that would be unconstitutional. That would violate your First Amendment right to freedom of speech. Because not only can Congress, basically stop you from saying something, obviously with some limitations, they also cannot force you to say something you don't want to do. So laws cannot contradict the Constitution. Next is the Article 7, that is the ratification. Obviously, this document had to be ratified by the 13 states, and you needed you need 9 states to ratify this in order for it to take effect. And Delaware, their nickname is the first state because they were the first state to ratify the document in December of 1787. And you can see the vote there, 30-0. Rhode Island was the last state to ratify the Constitution, and they actually did not ratify the Constitution until we had actually been a country for about a year or so. And it was a pretty close vote there, 34-32. And like I said earlier, if you want to be a state, one of the first things you have to do is you actually have to approve or ratify the Constitution. So at this point, all 50 states have ratified it. So those are our 7 chapters. The next thing we're going to move on to is our constitutional principles. So these are things that are included in the Constitution. They're not specifically stated, but they've been interpreted to include these. First and foremost is separation of powers, meaning that each branch has different responsibilities. We talked about that back in Article 1, 2, and 3. Congress makes the laws, executive branch enforces them, judicial branch judges them. And so each group has their own rights and responsibilities, and they get their power from the Constitution. They don't get their power from each other. If this sounds really familiar, that is because back in world history, you learned about Baron de Montesquieu, and this is one of the principles he felt strongly about, that the branches should be separate and they should get their power from a document, not from each other. So next is the principle of checks and balances. Each branch has powers that limit the powers of the other branches. This is a way of checking and balancing out power, which is what the principle says. So, for example, if the legislative branch passes a law or passes a bill, the president can veto the bill. If the Congress really likes the bill and they want it to pass over his veto, over his rejection, then they can override his veto with a 2/3 majority vote. After that's all been said and done, if the law is unconstitutional, the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, will rule it unconstitutional. So it's a way of balancing out the power to ensure that one branch doesn't have too much authority over our country. There's 5 examples of checks and balances. I've just given you one, as I just said. And this power actually came from the Supreme Court. The first one is judicial review. They have the power to declare acts of the other 2 branches unconstitutional. So if the president passes an executive order, if Congress passes a law that is unconstitutional, the Supreme Court can strike it down. And the Supreme Court gave themselves this power in 1803 in the Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison. The second example of checks and balances is, I actually gave it in the intro, Congress writes laws, a president can veto the law, and the Congress can override the veto with a 2/3 vote, and then the Supreme Court can declare the law unconstitutional. So that's an example of how all 3 branches come into play. Our third example is the president has the power to nominate justices, but then the Senate has to approve those nominations. So he doesn't just get to appoint people to the Supreme Court or to other federal court systems. The Senate must approve those nominations. The fourth example of check and balance is the president gets to negotiate treaties, but again, the Senate has to approve them. Probably the best example from history that I think you should be aware of is from World War I. Woodrow Wilson was the president during World War I. The war ended in 1918, and then he spent about 4 months out of our country over in France negotiating the Treaty of Versailles. One of the things he really wanted in the treaty was a League of Nations, an organization to help prevent wars in the future. And that ends up being in the Treaty of Versailles. He comes back. The Senate does not want to approve this. They want to become isolationists. He's not willing to compromise. So the Senate ends up rejecting the Treaty of Versailles. So we technically remain at war with Germany until 1921, when we negotiated a separate treaty with them. Our final example of checks and balances actually just happened this past year. The House of Representatives can impeach judges and executive officials, including the president, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would be the judge. So he would preside over the impeachment hearings in the Senate. So the House can vote to charge somebody with a crime. The Chief Justice would be the judge, and the trial would be held in the Senate, and they would also be the jury. And this happened actually just this past year in December. The House of Representatives impeached Trump. The trial was in the Senate, and he was acquitted. And John Roberts was the judge in that trial, as he is the Supreme Court Justice. We're going to talk about all 5 of these examples in more depth as we go through our semester. If at any point you guys have questions about the notes, I know I went through them pretty quickly. You are welcome and encouraged to email me, even if you're not in my class. And I'm sure your government teacher would be willing to go over this with you as well. So I hope you guys took some notes. You'll have access to this recording, so you can always rewind and go back and watch it again. And thanks for your time.